Wow.
Can you hear the dog?
Yeah.
A dog.
I guess the dog actually sort of might have the best questions. That'd be interesting.
You'll definitely have the best answers.
Absolutely.
All right, we're live. Hi, everyone. Alrighty, perfect. All right, so we'll give it a minute before we start. Sorry, Glenn, will you start, or do you want me to just launch into my?
Yeah, I suggest you make a start, Brogan, and then I'll pick up from there.
Okay, perfect. Just wait for the audience to go up a bit.
At this point, the panel have no idea whether the audience is in single, double, or higher figures.
All right, perfect. Well, people are joining. I'll say hi. Thank you so much for joining us for our first online presentation. Thank you to Glenn and the wonderful speakers for joining us about 10 days before we decided to run this event. So it's a quick turnaround, but I think we have a good conversation ahead of us. Quick introduction to PTRC. We are a training company based in the UK. We specialize in the training of transport planners, engineers, designers, and placemakers. And we are also part of the Chartered Institute of Logistics and Transport, the membership organization for professionals leading the movement of goods and people. We are very excited to have organized this event, which has attracted 1,200 professionals from around the globe, highlighting that it is a conversation that the industry is looking to take part in. So thanks again, everyone, for joining us. And Glenn, I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you very much, Brogan. And welcome everyone to this PTRC Fireside Chat. As Brogan says, the response has been absolutely phenomenal. And I must say welcome to our international audience for today's event. As well as the UK, we've had registrations for the event from countries including Australia, the US, Canada, Belgium, China, Germany, India, Ireland, Italy, the Netherlands, New Zealand, Pakistan, Philippines, Portugal, Sweden, Turkey, the United Arab Emirates, the list goes on. So welcome to you all. My name's Glenn Lyons. I'm the Mott MacDonald Professor of Future Mobility at the University of the West of England in Bristol in the UK. The term fireside chat is attributed, I've taught myself from Wikipedia, to a series of evening radio addresses given by US President Franklin D. Roosevelt between 1933 and 1944. Roosevelt connected directly with his public through these intimate sessions as he addressed the banking crisis, the recession, and the World War during that period. Our fireside chat here in modern times doesn't seek to be presidential, but does bring together a really great set of minds on our panel to address this theme: the global shock of COVID-19. Will it jolt the transport sector into significant change? Rather than reading out their impressive biographies, in the interest of time, I'm going to ask each of our panelists to introduce themselves when they make their opening remarks in a few minutes. And thank you to all of you listening in via YouTube. For those who submitted questions for our panel in advance, we'll come back to some of those later on. During the session itself, do please post questions and comments via YouTube. We'll not be able to do them all justice today, of course, in the time, but we will be making sure they're captured as part of the YouTube recording, and therefore they will contribute to the richness that others can benefit from afterwards. So before we turn to the panelists, I'd just like to set the scene. 25 years ago, I was a young postdoctoral researcher. I had a daily 35-mile one-way commute in my car to the university. And I remember very well going to my first proper meeting. It seemed very important, a milestone in my career, a meeting. And I was duly dressed in the normal uniform for a meeting of a shirt, tie, and suit. At the time, a friend of mine who was a computer scientist said, "Hey, check out this cool new thing called the World Wide Web." Well, of course, fast forward to today, and so much seems to have changed. I'm sat at home in a heavy metal t-shirt, chairing an event on the web involving hundreds of people who've driven absolutely nowhere. Well before COVID-19 arrived, I had been, alongside others, of the view that the old mobility regime that's defined our society, and indeed many of our careers, was destabilizing, brought about by the digital age colliding and then merging with the motor age. We were in a period of regime transition to a new type of future mobility. And I think COVID-19 has introduced a huge shock to this already destabilizing mobility system. The rearview mirror now gives us even less of a clue regarding what lies ahead. But with deep and now further deepening uncertainty comes great opportunity. The forecast-led paradigm of transport planning, I would suggest, needs to move aside now for the vision-led paradigm. With the current fluidity in mobility, how can we take positive action to shape a better future? Decide and provide, you might say, instead of predict and provide. At the heart of this is realizing that we need triple access planning instead of simply transport planning. What people are looking for in society, socially and economically, is access to other people, goods, services, and opportunities. The transport system provides this through physical mobility. The land use system provides it through spatial proximity. And the telecommunications system provides access through digital connectivity. And thank goodness for digital connectivity. The question is, how do we configure the future of the triple access system and its use to best support the sort of society that we want? I'd be surprised, I have to say, if we don't see COVID-19 accelerating a regime change in transport planning as well as in our mobility system. This remains to be seen, of course. I must say I'm amazed by some colleagues who seem to be optimistically holding on to the idea that the old armory of transport planning, analysis and appraisal is still where we are at now, and that the COVID-19 shock will be over, in inverted commas, relatively soon. Talking of soon, more immediately, we're all being bombarded by news. World oil prices went negative in the last few days. Some are calling for fuel tax to be increased. The aviation sector may well never recover and seems likely at least to shrink. Cities are enjoying cleaner air and clearer skies than many have experienced in their lifetimes. Motorized mobility is in retreat while digital connectivity has moved center stage. Leisure cycling as well as utility cycling is up and streets are being enjoyed. Tactical urbanism has come to the fore. Temporary reallocation of road space to support active travel in place of the car. A legal challenge is being mounted to the UK government's road building programme. Similarly, there's a call for more investment in digital infrastructure for the future. There's optimism that this may be, in fact, a great positive catalyst to support the decarbonisation of the transport sector that's urgently needed. The list goes on. Impossible then to contemplate getting to grips with this in a single fireside chat today, but we're going to see what we can do. So I'd now like to turn to our 6 panelists who will each have 3 minutes to offer their opening remarks. So let's please begin with Karen. Over to you, Karen. Thank you. Don't forget your microphone. Karen, we're not hearing you at this point. Okay, how about we switch to Sunita, if Sunita's happy with that, and we'll give Karen a moment just to sort out the tech. Sunita, are you okay to come in for us?
Yeah, I can come in. It does look like Karen's managed to work out how to sort her microphone, but if you can hear me, I'll crack on.
Okay, thanks. Don't worry, Karen, we'll come back to you.
So by way of a little bit of introduction, and thanks, Glenn, I've been working in transport planning in the public sector for around 22 years now, and of a wide range of over a wide range of activities, but specialising really in strategic planning and major schemes development, and the commissioning of a wide range of activities, including sustainable transport projects. I spent quite a lot of time in Plymouth working in an urban environment, and in the last 5 years I moved to Somerset County Council, where for the majority of time I led the transport planning function. But in February I started a new role with the authority, and looking at how we commission our services more efficiently and effectively. That role has been a little bit short-lived because about 5 weeks ago I was asked to lead a team responding to the COVID-19 incident, and how we look at transport and logistics that are created by the incident itself. So I've got some real current experience of what COVID-19 is doing to our transport networks. So just picking up on the consequences of COVID-19 on the future of mobility, I think when I started to think about this question, my first thoughts were, has this incident really reinforced the future of mobility assertion that we will be less mobile in the future, or is this a short-term blip? And I don't think I've got any answers to that question, but really I think there's quite a lot of change of perceptions been going on, and Glenn has mentioned a few in his introduction, but I think what's happened is that given a big enough stick, a greater proportion of people have been able to change their behaviour, and the stick that we've had has really meant that a lot of people are now working more frequently from home or shopping less frequently, and this to me is going to have a big impact on where the development sector goes. For example, do we need to keep building office space? I think I'm going to pose a lot of questions in here with no real answers, but do we need to keep building so much office space? We've missed some social interaction because we haven't been going to the office, but actually, can we get social interaction in a different way, and do lifestyle factors need to come into play as well as kind of developments? Does the design of our homes need to change to accommodate more home working? I don't think we've really thought about that. House design and house building has stayed the same for quite a long period of time, and actually I noticed with colleagues that if you're working at home more, you need a better space to work. And Glenn's given me a 1 minute left sign, and I've got a huge amount more to say, so this is going to be really good. And I then thought about kind of more activities that are going to happen from the home. So employers and education, do we need more space for these activities in the home rather than being at work? I'm going to talk a bit later about bus operations, but really our bus operations have suffered during this crisis, and how we deal with rural mobility, particularly in Somerset and in those rural areas that are similar, has been a challenge, but it's also revealed some strength in the systems that we have in place. And I think if Glenn's going to give me the nod, I think that'll do for me for now.
Thank you, Sunita. We appreciate there will be plenty more to come. Karen, let's give you a chance to see whether you're ready to come back in for us. We're still not hearing you, I'm afraid.
Hello, can you hear me now?
We can, yes, we can.
Perfect.
Over
Excellent.
to you.
Sorry about that, just a bit of IT. So good afternoon, everyone. So my name is Karen Agbebiaka, and I'm a Chief Officer at the London Borough of Islington. I'm responsible for a number of key services in the Public Realm Department. So I've got over 30 years experience in local government and the private sector in the UK and internationally as well. My main areas of expertise are in transport, traffic, highways, energy and environment, street works and construction. My main achievement to date include the delivery of the Olympic route network for the London 2012 Olympics, which involved moving the Games family between venues and accommodations across a network of roads and transport measures, such as Games lanes, which was a vast challenge, involved a number of agencies, delivery partners, stakeholders, organisations, supply chain and interest groups to avoid the conflicts and the impacts of the Olympics. In my spare time, I enjoy mentoring professional engineers and transport planners and feel great satisfaction in seeing the growth of those I mentor. So today I'm going to focus my views roughly on the experience to date in relation to COVID from an urban local authority. So Islington is situated in central London and is bounded by the boroughs of Haringey in the north, Hackney in the east, the City of London in the south, and Camden in the west. Population of Islington is about 240,000. It's quite a small local authority and it's very dense, roughly 16,000 people per square kilometre. Islington suffers from the fact that there's not a lot of green space. About 13% of the borough is covered with green space. Our residents, we have 65% of our residents do not own cars. We have 10 underground stations, 5 overground stations and 6 railway stations. And we were one of the first boroughs to actually implement a full 20-mile-an-hour zone. And of course, Islington is home to the best football club, Arsenal. So after the initial impact of the lockdown and the notable reduction in actual air quality from the reduction in vehicles, this has led to a big impact in relation to the street working industry, which is one of the areas that I'm responsible for. So from a streetworks point of view, there's been lots of information and direction from the Department of Transportation and DCMS as well from the utility companies. And they are still allowed to actually undertake emergency works on the network. And the reason being is that they need to maintain their assets to make sure that we're able to use Wi-Fi, broadband, and all the things that we need to use while we're working from home. So it was deemed that this industry was quite a key industry and that works should continue for emergencies, urgents, and also to maintain their assets. This has resulted to quite a big impact on my team, and they've been extremely overwhelmed, having to learn new skills from working from home. And having to undertake assessments for permits approval has been quite an impact. So just give you a little taste in terms of some of the increased works that have actually happened. So as of yesterday, we had 34 works on the network, 22 emergencies, 60 permits that are due to start in the next 14 days, which is quite a large amount considering a borough as Islington is quite small. The majority of the works have been focused on the main networks because obviously the local residential roads have been parked up because people haven't actually been using their vehicles to actually go to work. So the utility companies have actually been focusing on the main networks because they've been quite clear. So I suppose from an industry, a streetworks point of view, there's been some positives and also there's been some major impacts that we've had to adapt as a team. One being the fact that the team of staff actually understand the network today. They understand the peaks, they understand the congestion areas, they understand what can be done and what can't be done on certain networks. And this has changed because of the patterns, the modal shift, the fact that there are more people walking, there are more people cycling, and also the fact that there's been the 1 hour exercise and that it's seen an increase in people using parks and walking to and from those locations. So issuing permits for utilities to undertake works on those networks has been quite difficult, but we're now at a stage that we kind of understand the peaks and being able to make sure that we do only approve those works that will cause minimum impact. On top of this, obviously, the hospitals, the temporary morgues and all of those, that we've had to make sure that we don't cause problems with those when we're approving works, and also trying to social distance as well for some of my staff that are actually on site doing inspections has been quite a challenge. But we're nearly there. We have also learned some positive things. We've realized that there's some things that we can actually do working from home. So, and there's some things that really work well and some that kind of don't. So I see that post the COVID, and when we get back to normality, whatever normality may be, there will be a review of how we undertake our works and how the street work industry will move forward.
Okay, thank you, Karen. I'm going to cut in there if that's okay.
Yep.
I think that set the scene very nicely, and this raises for me this issue of, you know, how agile are we able to be, or how agile are our authorities able to be in response? And I think you've illustrated very nicely as a scene setter there from the borough's perspective. So thank you. I'm going to pass over now to Alison, please. Alison, we can't hear you yet.
Okay.
Now we can.
Good, I'm glad to hear that. So my name is Alison Irvin. I am the Director for Transport Strategy and Analysis with Transport Scotland, which is the Scottish Government's national transport agency. I think if you're not familiar with the devolution settlement, kind of think of us as a bit of a combination of the Department for Transport, Highways England, and a bit of Network Rail and train operating companies brought into bear. My own specific remit within Transport Scotland covers our transport strategy, our investment planning, climate change policy, transport appraisal and forecasting. I've been a transport planner for over 30 years. I'll not say how many over 30 years, we'll just leave it at that. I have to say that over the last couple of months, the business as usual activity of Transport Scotland has been largely paused, and we have turned around an agency of about 500 people to support Scottish Ministers' response to the COVID emergency, which is no mean feat. My view is that the consequences of COVID-19 and what the future might mean for mobility is that we're in a situation here where we can see some fundamental changes in how society is working at a local level, at a regional level, at a national level, and certainly at a global level as well. And that will have implications for the transport sector and beyond. So we all know transport is a derived demand, but it's in the business of moving people and goods, something which has been fundamentally altered by the social distancing measures of which we're all having to live under at the moment. Our economy has been significantly altered, our society has been significantly altered, and I think you can start to see the messages that are coming from the health advisors at the daily press conferences, both in Scotland and at a UK level, that there are going to be measures needed in place until such a time as there are health-related ways in which to control the virus. And so they're going to be with us for quite some time. I think it's fair to say nobody knows the consequences. My view is that this is a paradigm shift. None of the normal assumptions that we can make within transport planning hold true anymore. But whatever we do moving forward in terms of whether that's a restart, recovery and transition will require really good collaboration, particularly across the health sector with land use, planning and transport now more than ever, so that we can let people live their lives as best that they can and as safely as they can. Sorry, Glenn, you put me off there waving that nearly time up sticker. I think we will be focusing on the priorities from our national transport strategy, which are about reducing inequalities, taking climate action, delivering inclusive economic growth and improving our health and well-being. My concern is that this needs to happen really quickly.
Thank you very much, Alison. And moving straight on to Fintan. Over to you, Fintan. Thank you.
So Glenn, kind of Thank you very much, and good afternoon. I'm Fintan Geraghty. I work for WSP, based in London. My background is in transport economics. I've been doing it now for 30 years. It's gone by very quickly indeed. It's a very interesting time actually, because although I've effectively done the actual same type of work over that time, things have actually definitely changed, because we've actually almost gone from looking at the actual old style way of actually looking at transport schemes, where we looked at things like journey time savings, and we've now seen, I suppose, the last 5 to 10 years or so, that there's now a much greater focus on I guess actual larger economic impacts. And I think just prior to the whole COVID shutdown, there was lots of very interesting things actually going on. So for example, here in this UK, we were looking at trying to change the actual government the actual Green Book guidance to try and capture more more impact types. There was this whole there's this whole aim to actually level up. So I think that we've actually seen a lot of very, very common trends that I guess it'd be very, very good to actually see, and to actually talk about how those will actually carry on after we end this whole shutdown period. I think that it's actually a really key time for transport planning, because there'll be an actual very, very strong need for our skills and our expertise as we actually go forward. And I think just actually looking forward to a debate today's debate, there are lots of actually very, very good themes there as well. So I think that's pretty much it from my side. And again, thank you very much, and obviously looking forward to the rest of the actual conversation. So again, thank you very much.
Thank you, Fintan. And Brian, if you'd like to come in now, please.
Thank you. Found the mute button. That's all good. Yeah, I wanted to take up where you left off in 1944, Glenn, and talk about one of the great wrongs of transport planning, and how I'm hoping this emergency, although terrible at the moment, might help us address that. And that's like the assumption that commuting by private car is somehow the future. For me, it started around those cozy fireside chats and has gone to infect the world, really. And I'll just I'll talk about when I started. Everybody's been talking about 30 years ago. I started around about that time as well. And when I was out riding around the South Circular with an engineer at TfL, Transport for London, actually it's about 20 years ago now. But anyway, he was talking to me about, it was very near the end of his days. He was the only engineer they had at Transport for London that did any kind of cycling stuff, and now that's really what I want to focus on there. And he was telling me the problem in the UK is that we all got into the American vision of personal car ownership, and rather than the kind of more continental go around by biking now, and that kind of chasm in the consciousness of the UK has been a problem ever since with what we're doing. There's a really negative connotation with cycling, that was somehow kind of a nuisance in there, and like, why are you doing stuff for cycling? Nobody does it. Come on, that's old school. That's from the 1800s. What are we going on about? Whereas if we flash forward to now, really in the middle of the emergency, it's cycling that's kind of helping out, and all the stuff that we've been talking about for 30 years, you can see it on the streets. Cyclists are now our key workers getting to work when they can't get in the car. We finally acknowledge that the cars that are driving around are wounding or killing 160,000 people a year in the UK. That's suddenly a strain on the NHS that we can no longer accept in there. So a lot of the things that we've been saying have been brought to the fore. I personally am out riding around with my daughter. We're dropping off food for the elderly people in there. And the point I want to make is that I'm hoping this kind of addresses that kind of social norm issue we had with cycling in there, that people actually see, actually it's quite good getting around by bike. You can still get there. Actually, you can do a 20-mile commute in an hour. You can get around there. It's a really effective clean and fun way of getting around there. And I'm hoping that's not just during the emergency, but we can have a different kind of mindset towards cycling as we come out the other side and go, actually, that was quite useful. Actually, I quite like riding around with my children and enjoying the local area. And isn't it nice not to hear the constant car noise down all the single streets in there? So I'm hoping this is a real change where we can get a bit more continental, as it were, and see cycling in a kind of positive light there. And I could have talked about walking as well, but generally it's like, how do we get people out of cars and how, oh yeah, I was coming to an end anyway, Glenn, that's good enough. How do we get people to change the paradigm, as Scotland quite rightly said in there? I'm hoping we don't come out saying, phew, let's go back to the way it was, because it's been quite nice having the fresh air in there. And I think most people want a change now, and they're kind of ready for the big challenge of our lives, which is the climate emergency when we come out the other side. And that's what I'll probably talk about in a bit more detail as we go through the questions. But that's my opening gambit. Like 70 years of wrong could change now. Let's get something positive out of this.
Thank you very much, Brian. And last but not least, Sonia, over to you.
Thanks so much, Glenn. So I'm Sonia Byers. I'm Chief Exec of Women in Transport. We're a professional network that supports the professional development of women working in the transport industry. So I'm going to concentrate on the kind of related opportunities of COVID-19 for the future of mobility. So, I mean, there are lots of opportunities here, but focus on three in particular. I think there's a real opportunity here to fast track the reallocation of space. We've been talking about that for a long time, around reprioritising our space away from the private car and looking at the space more for pedestrians and cyclists. So I think it's quite exciting to see the pop-up cycle lanes coming in place across Europe. And hopefully I've seen Glasgow and Edinburgh looking at implementing those. And we've seen Hammersmith and Fulham implemented today some measures to increase space for cyclists and pedestrians. So hopefully those won't be temporary measures, more an acceleration of pace on plans that were already there. And we've been waiting for this kind of digital revolution that's had to be fast-tracked because of the crisis. And I think that's a really positive thing. And if we can keep that going and work together across public and private sector to maintain that momentum, that's really positive. I think there are exciting opportunities, particularly from a diversity and inclusion perspective, around looking at the way that we work and new ways of working, agile working. Of course, there are jobs that we have to do that rely on us going into a workplace, and we can't forget that travel is going to be an essential part of that. But maybe our peaks will look different, maybe our shift patterns might look different for those people that have to go to a workplace. But for those that can work from home and are able to do their jobs remotely, I think that's a real opportunity for us to make our places more accessible, more agile, and also make the things that we do just generally, even whether that's conferencing, whether that's working and leisure opportunities, more accessible to a wider proportion of the population. And I think also there are opportunities here to improve accessibility, not just from a digital perspective. If we think about that triple access that Glenn mentioned, it's about that digital revolution, making sure there's a levelling up across all sectors of society, but also looking at our places in a more inclusive way. So I think there were lots of opportunities here, and if we really embrace that now, it can be a really exciting time for us. And that's it.
Great, thank you very much, Sonia, and indeed all of you. And I'm sorry if I frightened any of our panelists with my little time management signs, not intended. We're already seeing some of the questions coming through from the audience, but I want to tie one or two of those into really across your remarks, perhaps particularly what Alison was saying. It very much struck me that we've got three different tasks. There's dealing with the here and now, and we've heard about some of the stuff that Karen's involved with, for example. But then there's dealing with the transition out of COVID-19, which perhaps gives the illusion that that's a fairly short episode. But then there's dealing with what happens beyond that, shaping the future in the medium to long term, which Brian and others were getting at. And with those three in mind, one of our audience has asked, do we have the capacity to deal with what's in front of us. I mean, it seems to me we're facing the fight of our lives as transport professionals now. And one of those three things I've mentioned would be challenging enough. But if we take our eye off the ball for the other two, are we going to let the old regime, the old incumbents come back in and reassert the old ways rather than create the great opportunities that might be in front of us? So I don't know if any of our panelists would like to react to that. Are we equipped for the fight of our lives ahead?
Yeah, I mean,
Vincent,
Glenn,
and then Brian. Yeah.
Yeah, sorry, just to actually kind of start off, I mean, I mean, sort of, I guess the actual sort of impact depends on the actual kind of sort of transport mode. So I think that sort of, as you actually kind of said earlier, obviously kind of sectors such as sort of aviation are going to be really sort of massively sort of hit here. And again, maybe if you look at the rail and the actual sort of and the actual sort of public transport sort of market, I guess where we've looked at trying to actually sort of privatize those, there actually could be a very, very sort of big, and actually kind of very, very big sort of change there. So just in terms of the sort of UK rail sort of franchise kind of system, I guess that could, that will actually sort of massively change. And I guess the actual same for the actual bus sector too. I guess that with actual, I suppose, road and sort of car kind of travel, it really depends on the levels of a demand. Is there going to be a relatively slow sort of comeback from the whole sort of crisis? Are we going to see kind of sort of short-term sort of road demand, sort of really sort of tail off? Is there then going to be quite an actual sharp curve sort of upwards as we actually sort of get back to sort of previous levels of sort of a demand? So I guess you really need to look at the actual types of sort of transport and then actually sort of focus kind of on those kind of individual modes. Perhaps obviously in the different sort of countries, things are actually quite sort of different anyway. But I think that each kind of transport sort of sector has got its own very, very different sort of characteristics and will actually face its own sort of problems.
Okay, thank you. And I'll pick Brian up and then Alison, and then I'll move on to another question if that's okay. Brian.
Yeah, just want to talk about, obviously everybody's working in emergency planning now, we're trying to respond in that, but I wanted to mention from a kind of modeling side of things, like Lewis Ortizar's theory of like the big shock theory, that something big happens in society in there and it changes the way we do our planning and people find more efficient ways. It's not like a big road closure or a bridge goes down and suddenly people go, actually, I could have walked and cycled out. Actually, there's another train in there. So I'm hoping this is enough of a shake to make us think about, are we doing things in the right way? Particularly in the UK, we've been kind of plodding on, going, yeah, we know all the cars are bad, we know public transport's good, we know people should be walking and cycling, but we've been enabling more and more growth in the private car use, and I will keep going back to that point in there. I'm hoping this is like the end of the line. We've hit the wall and people are seeing it for what it is now that we've got a different kind of a perspective out there on the street. So I'm hoping we can move on and be slightly more efficient and going, actually, are we planning things in the right way? All the things that we've been saying in policy terms, now's the time to put into practice. And really, initially it'll be emergency response, but then it should really be the way we do business. That's my take on it.
Okay, thanks, Brian. And Alison, this fight of our lives, what say you?
Yeah. So I was just going to take a slightly different perspective, I think, than the other two contributions. So the question was about capacity to deal with the sort of the restart and then the recovery element both at the same time, which I do agree is a challenge. However, the challenge I think actually comes is more about leadership and the ability to set the direction. We're operating in an unprecedented times where we don't fully understand the full extent of how the virus that we're all dealing with is going to operate and how it's going to change society. So we have to remain agile and just recognise that everything is uncertain and everything is unchanging, but that what really is needed through all of this is good leadership and good direction with that vision forward. Yeah.
Whether we have enough of that in the supply we need, I guess we'll be discovering in the weeks and months ahead.
We will. Yep.
I can come to another question that's come from the audience, but to set the scene for it, I just wonder how many of us, and it would be understandable, are more in a state of denial about the enormity of what's going on around us, including the climate crisis that still sits there patiently waiting, or not so patiently, beyond the COVID crisis. And I'm wondering whether we're going to see a process of going through, the denial to the anger, to the resignation, to the acceptance of a need for some really fundamental changes. And coming to a question that's been asked from the audience, what happens to those planned infrastructure projects now we're presented with a very serious prospect of completely reconfigured demand for not just the immediate, but the medium and longer term future? Do we just keep turning the handle on the tools that we've used before, tweaking a few numbers, or is this really forcing a complete rethink? Again, I open the floor perhaps to some of the panelists who've not had a pitch in yet. Sunita.
First, okay, I have to turn the mic on. Sorry. Yeah, so I think if this situation has taught us one thing, it's probably that we've got enough capacity for cars, and that we probably don't need to carry on trying to build more capacity. That's from an educated transport planning perspective. I think if you sit from a different perspective, I've got to get to work every day and I need to do my business every day, you might find that there's a different take on some of this. And I just wonder whether we need to kind of just go back a little bit and start to talk to people a bit more about what they think and what they think should be the new paradigm, rather than what we think it should be.
Can I just before we move across to Karen, because what you've touched upon there, Sunita, is yet another question from the audience, which is, as we move to introduce these temporary measures which may then become permanent, are we engaging with the public on their views about all of this? And I see a bit of a tension there, because we're going to need to be agile to avoid the incumbents of the old regime reasserting the old normal, and we've got a chance to move quickly, but are we able to move quickly in a respectful way that achieves that engagement?
So I think we're going to struggle with that right now. I think Alison has said that a lot of her resources are off doing other things during this crisis. A lot of Somerset's resources are currently doing a lot of other things during this crisis, and actually to have the ability to think about the way forwards right now, as well as dealing with the crisis and the resurgence after the crisis, is a real challenge for us.
Yeah, okay, thank you. Karen, I know you wanted to come in. We can't hear you yet, Karen, although your microphone does seem to be on. Sorry, we're not hearing you, Karen. I know that's very frustrating because your technology does seem to be... oh, there we are. We can hear you, I think. No, we've lost you. Sorry, we're not picking you up, Karen, I'm afraid. Appreciate that's very frustrating at your end as well. Would anyone else like to build upon that before we move on to some other territories? Yes, Alison.
Okay, so just in terms of the big infrastructure projects, I think it's too early to say what's going to happen with them. I think you need to look at the fact that in the generality, government looks at infrastructure projects as a way of boosting the economy. Where transport's going to fit into all of that in a time when national resources are going to become more and more constrained, I think very definitely remains to be seen. In terms of whether we're in a position to take the public with us at this point in time, I think we would need to be really careful about what messages we were putting out to members of the public, because they're having to take on board an awful lot of really complex information already. So cluttering the landscape on some transport related issues now might not be the time, but looking ahead, to next month or to the month after that might be the time for those kind of conversations.
Yeah, it does strike me that, and of course it's been part of our professional conversation for a while, that what we understand to mean by robust analysis and decision support is a point of debate. And I think that I sense there will be greater challenge and questions, whether it's from the public or from within the sector, about how we're able to justify, or our political masters are able to justify, the difficult decisions that they will have to make, because I think some of our established tools in the transport planning armory just aren't ready for this, or at least they need complete recalibration and reworking, even if they've got the capability. I'm seeing Brian nod there. Oh, sorry, Finton.
Yeah, so just to add, Glenn, I think that there's obviously this I guess this a very strong sort of Keynesian view that you can use sort of major kind of transport schemes sort of as a way to actually sort of bounce back from major sort of crises. So I guess they've announced, say here, they're actually going ahead with sort of HS2. And I think they are trying to boost the number of sort of jobs that can actually help sort of build that. So I think there's still a case for, in terms of trying to sell major transport schemes to the sort of public, I think there is still a very, very sort of major role for these schemes to actually play. And perhaps it's really down to sort of government and sort of various agencies to really sort of sell the actual sort of benefits of that. So we aren't just kind of talking about trying to sort of model sort of transport schemes with things like kind of journey time kind of savings. We are really trying to look at their much larger impact. So in terms of actually sort of generating jobs during the actual sort of building phase, that actually kind of could be sort of, that actually could be sort of crucial sort of by itself. And then there's also the actual sort of issues that we know now that sort of transport schemes can boost sort of connectivity, sort of productivity as well. So there are various very strong sort of economic outputs that I think sort of transport schemes actually do sort of generate. So I think it's really down to us to help the sort of government actually sort of sell those sort of much larger sort of benefits.
But in the course of doing so, I suppose we ourselves as professionals have to kind of make sense of whether or not the frame has shifted for all of the things you said and the type of advice that we're given. I think we're all, and I'm not suggesting any of us have got kind of superiority above all this. I think we're all vulnerable to a degree of blinkering with all the professional training and development experience we've had to date, now being somewhat fractured by the new circumstances. Brian, did you want to come in on this, or you want to bide your time?
Might just bide my time for a minute, just because the window cleaners have just turned up, and all you're going to hear is banter at the moment. I do apologise. I will come in shortly, though.
Okay, no worries. Karen, I know, is desperate to come in, and I know how frustrating it is when your technology is not allowing you to. We'll try again, Karen. Can we hear you? I'm afraid we can't. You may want to try dialing out and dialing in again. I'm sorry with this situation. This might be a question I'm conscious I heard from Sonia. One of our other questions from the audience is around social exclusion or social inclusion. I think we're all very painfully aware that there are stories coming through already about, perhaps not surprisingly, the social inequities associated with how COVID itself is affecting society. But we know that pre-COVID, in spite of all the well-intended words, we've really struggled, not just within the transport sector, but across the economy, to truly create a situation where a rising tide lifts all boats, as we're told by certain quarters. Do you see a real threat to promoting greater equality, given the urgency we're going to face in terms of economic recovery and all manner of other issues?
I actually think there's an opportunity. I'd like to think about it in a more positive way, and maybe that's a bit naive of me. But I think when we look at our ability now, actually, we're talking about being agile, we're talking about adapting to change. We're seeing people really using technologies that they had no knowledge of or no ability to use before. So actually, I think there's an opportunity there actually for social inclusion. So if we can, as a society, as a government, as a nation, and also globally, bring everybody up to a certain standard in terms of their digital connectivity, because of course we know that not everybody is equal in that landscape at the moment and has equal access to technology. But actually, if we can do that, we can make it much more much easier for people to interact maybe and collaborate in a way that's going to be effective. What I'd really like to see, actually, where we have these big infrastructure schemes going forward, is maybe not sticking to rigidly to the plans that might have been set 10 years ago. Actually having that opportunity, we have some really good best practice across the world globally. When I think back a couple of years ago, I went to Perth and was really fascinated to see the way that the network actually prioritised. You had completely segregated walking and cycling, you had the train line going down the middle of the highway, and then you had the highway, and you had adequate space for everybody, and that made a real difference to the space. So, you know, as we bring these big infrastructure projects forward, these big transport schemes forward, and we make changes in our cities and even in our more rural areas, can we incorporate some of that best practice that we're seeing elsewhere? And can we really engage with people that are directly affected by that? And I think then we can start to break down that kind of social exclusion bit and think about really what are the needs of the individuals in those spaces. I appreciate maybe in the immediate, with this urgency, it's not going to happen. But I think as those schemes, you know, these schemes don't get built straight away. There's an opportunity there for us to really embrace it. And if we do embrace collaboration across all the space and recognise that this affects everybody globally, and that there's a real opportunity here, I think that could be a really powerful thing.
I mean, of course, this whole territory is hugely complex and almost on the point of being intractable. But I'm seeing some challenges moving between these different topics. So I think what you've set out there, I would, you know, personally sign up to, as it were, as a set of aspirations. But coming back to one of the earlier points about we really need to act quickly. Is it possible to achieve the sort of thing you're saying quickly? And also coming back to simply the capacity within our sector. I'm also very mindful of, you'll be familiar with these phrases, you know, if all you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. We've got a particular makeup of our transport profession at the moment that is geared towards pre-COVID and even prior to that. We need a different makeup of skills in proportion, I think, post-COVID or during the emergence from COVID. Do you think that's achievable?
That's a big question. I mean, we already had a skills shortage. We're already facing a massive skills shortage in the transport industry, and we're losing you know, good talented people to other sectors. So, you know, there is a real challenge there where revenues have been hit, where our businesses have been challenged, and say reallocation of resources to kind of the emergency crisis areas. So, you know, it's very difficult to see past that crisis period to something that looks differently. None of us has a kind of magic ball that will can foresee what the future might hold. But I think that actually, picking up on Alison's point, if we have the right leadership and direction, and that has to come right across the board in the public and private and the government, and we can pull together in some sort of same direction, then it is achievable. And look what we've achieved in just a matter of weeks as a society. Look what businesses have achieved. You know, we've all seen businesses that have said it's not possible to work from home, it's not possible for us to put the infrastructure in place, all of those things, but they've done it because they've had to do it. So I think, you know, faced with a situation where we have to change, where we're forced to change, where actually it's a matter of life and death that we do this. And if we can really recognise that it's a long-term investment in the future of our nation and the economic growth of the nation, then yeah, I think that it is ultimately achievable, even though it might seem aspirational.
Okay, thanks, Sonia. Karen, I'm going to come to you in a moment. We're still not hearing you, though. Do you want to have another shot at that? No, I'm afraid still not hearing Karen. I do apologise. Now, we've been fielding some questions from the audience during the session itself, but a number of you were kind enough to send through to us questions in advance of the session, which have been shared with our panelists. And what I'm going to do now is invite each of our panelists to pick out a theme or a particular question that really caught their eye from that set, and speak to that question, please. Now, I was going to start with Karen, but let's just see. Not yet, it seems.
Can you hear me?
We can. Quick, let's grab it while it's good. Yes. So, Karen, over to you.
Yeah, I just wanted to make a comment. Sorry, something wrong with my IT. I'm clearly not very good at this. I just wanted to comment on what Sonia said, and I think some of the things that I've noticed over the years is how all our different industries work in silos. So for example, a big infrastructure project such as HS2 tend to focus on the rail elements of it and not incorporating some of the public realm elements as well. And I think that if we as an industry can pull together and understand that it's the whole and not just the part, that we might be able to introduce some of the things that you mentioned there that are happening in Perth. When we're making big changes and we're introducing big infrastructure projects. I think we as an industry need to start working together. And some of those things did happen during the Olympics and clearly have happened actually now. And I think the fact that sometimes we over consult because we feel we need to consult and we analyze and so on and so forth. And this period hasn't allowed us to do that. It's basically allowed people to pull their brains together and come up with some quick solutions. So maybe we need to think about our consultation process, how we engage, who we engage, and how we make decisions. And I think that goes back to Alison. That's all about leadership and direction and giving everyone the ability to think out of the box and do things differently. And sometimes overthinking overcomplicates and delays things. So I just wanted to raise a point on that.
No, thank you, Karen. And again, I guess that there has to be hope in here, and I'm pleased to see some of our panelists trying to give us a glass half full rather than half empty. But if I can paraphrase what you've said, you're saying what we really need is an integrated transport system. And of course, as some of you will know, the joke there really is that you go back to Yes Minister, the famous TV series, when 35 years ago, they were saying just that. And it was laughable then because we seem to struggle to get that joining up, partly because of resources and siloing of those resources and capacity and so on. Do you think perhaps this shock to the system could be enough to enable us finally to get that better joined up thinking and practice?
Yeah, we have a great opportunity now to be able to do something different, and I'm so glad that this has just come upon us. So yeah, I feel that we shouldn't lose this opportunity. Even though we're in a difficult climate at the moment, we still need to kind of have some momentum and have a plan so that we can, when we get out of this, that we don't lose some of the good practices, that we're able to think out the box and that we're able to lobby government if we need to make changes. But yeah, I do feel that if we lose this opportunity, we'll just go back to the way things were and it will just be a shame. So yeah.
Okay, thank you, Karen. Now, so back to this point of asking our panelists to pick off questions that were sent to us before the session itself. Brian, your windows must be gleaming by now. Can we ask you to offer some thoughts?
Yeah, there was a question that I quite liked about how we keep people walking and cycling after the crisis, really, and it kind of ties a few things together. Like, well, one of the things we're doing to react to the crisis is acknowledging that our footways are very narrow. In fact, if you're trying to keep 2 meters distance and your footway is 800 mil wide, we've got an issue in there. So we're hoping that in the coming weeks, more and more local authorities will be responding to this and providing extra space so we don't have another peak situation in there. And then really from my side of things as a consultant who's worked in local authorities and worked on healthy streets and trying to promote walking and cycling, we've been after wider footways for a long time. We've also been after some cycling infrastructure to protect people in there. And again, at the moment, people are walking down the middle of the road because we have to do that. So really, it's like the French concept of the pedestrian priority street where you can walk everywhere and the car has to drive at kind of walking speed in there. All these things that we've been trying to make happen, and we get a few sporadic examples of there. I'm hoping we can start rolling them out en masse to to respond to the emergency, and then it's a question of afterwards saying, do we like this? Shall we keep it? Move on. And that's what I'm trying to promote in local authorities at the moment. So really, it's like it's getting the space to help with the emergency, and then it's asking people, are you happy with this new way of working, this new way of walking, this new way of cycling around there? Is this the kind of society that we want in there? And really, like, just to draw back on the previous comments, I mean, people are listening to the government now for the first time that I've heard in a long time about like statements and stuff, and acknowledging that we've claimed climate emergency, that there's a decarbonisation of transport strategy in there. So I'm hoping those big issues will be reflected in the way we actually design our streets, because very few people want to go back to the way we were. So yeah, ideally we can get all the things we want. I'll just mention one thing. I know I'm going on a little bit, but I was working with the London Cycling Campaign, and we put together a climate safe streets document report, and we're almost sheepish about bringing it out because during the emergency situation that we're in there. But we thought, well, actually, all these things are relevant now. One of the big calls is for a walking and cycling network, or for others for clean vehicles. Air quality has really come to the top of the tree, as it were, during the emergency, because people are saying that if there's poor air quality, it's directly linked to how you're going to respond to treatment during the crisis in there. So a lot of the things that we asked for and that we want to change about the planning system are all being acutely felt now. And I think if we react to them and then say, here's the benefits, I'm hoping we can keep that going forward, really, because I think it's a wake-up call for everybody, and we're having a good hard look at our streets and where we live, particularly in disadvantaged areas, and going, this isn't right. Actually, the way it's happening now is better for us, even though there's people dying. It's a terrible situation. My life's improved, my streets have improved in there. So I'm hoping we can keep that spirit going through, and everybody suddenly had a taste of what it means to live in a low traffic environment with slower speeds.
Thanks, Brian. And before I come to Sonia, I think what you've been saying ties in very well with a particularly thought-provoking question that has just come through from our audience. I'll read it out and then might attempt to paraphrase it to help you. If politicians listen to people, how can transport planners best help people who are currently in the middle of their eureka moment? So in other words, there is a danger, of course, that us as transport planners think we now know best, we're being very paternalistic towards the public. But actually, the great opportunity here could be that the public themselves are seeing a desperate wish for a new normal, and we need to somehow galvanize that appetite and help them vocalize that to our politicians. I don't know whether that's fair to throw that one back to you, Brian, and there may be one or two other panelists who want to chip in as well.
I think that's absolutely right. For so long in my profession, I'm a highway engineer, our currency is the car, and that's what we're all trained in to kind of design for, in the way we set streets out and the way we kind of model and do our signal time. And really, the currency should be the person and how they get around in the most efficient way, really. And I'm hoping that comes across at the moment, that we're dealing with people, and everybody's having to deal with, how do people walk in the street, how do people cross the road? We can't have them waiting too long. So all these things that everybody's moved into emergency planning, they're all thinking about individuals walking and cycling, how we cope for them. So I'm hoping that's a big shock to our industry. And yeah, absolutely right, we should be listening to people, and people in survey after survey after survey have been saying we want more walking and cycling, we want nicer places to live, we want better air quality, and it's about time we kind of change the profession to respond to that. And it's not giving up the mathematics of designing around the cars, because that's often what you get leveled at if you say think about people, think about children. But it's very important, and I'm a big fan of collaborative planning in general, right from the get-go when you have the first idea, and I'm hoping the industry change more towards that approach from now on.
Great. Okay. Thank you, Brian. So I'm going to move us on to Sonia. Your pick from the mix of questions that we had from participants beforehand.
So my pick was about, it was a question that wasn't assigned to anybody, but it said the lot is made about behaviour change being about nudging behaviour, and take this in the transport context. But now what we've seen is the stick needed to change behaviour. And I think for me, it's a bit of a balance. I think, obviously people are responding to the stick because this is a unique, unprecedented, to use a much used word at the moment, situation. And so people are recognising that this is a necessity right now. But I think in the long term, people's ability to accept that stick becomes less. And we also know that people are individuals. We live in a democracy, and not everybody is abiding by the rules that we have now, albeit they're not, you know, the restrictions are to a certain extent not policy, if you like, they're not rigid regulations. So I think for the future, it's always going to be about balance. There is a place for nudging behaviour, and there is a place for the stick. And hopefully we'll see some sort of hard measures, infrastructure measures that will help us sustain some of the positive things that we're seeing. For example, like the shared cycleways, more space for pedestrians, things that will enable us to live a bit of a more accessible, healthier lifestyle going forward. So that's my view of it. I think it has to be a balance.
So I suppose there are a lot of stakeholders or agencies who are capable of and maybe trying very hard and will be to nudge behaviour. So one of our challenges is, you know, not to assume everyone's trying to nudge society in the same direction. I'm going to put the panel on the spot here, but I should say you're very welcome to abstain. Talking about sticks, as the BBC put it, the Committee on Climate Change's chief suggested that with ridiculously low oil prices, we should be putting up tax on fuel. Now, do we leave the public just to go softly as they emerge from this? Are they really not going to be lured by those ridiculously low fuel prices, or should we be introducing an increase in fuel tax? So please feel free to abstain, but anyone prepared to put their hand up and say we should increase fuel tax? Okay, well, that's interesting. I'm not sure whether Karen, your hand's up for yes, or is it because you're trying to get back on the mic?
No, it's yes.
It is yes. Okay, right. Well, there we are. Not to suggest that everyone out there listening will agree on that. Okay, Fintan, would you like to come in on your pick from? Sorry, Alison, did you want to comment on that?
Yeah, I was just going to say I didn't vote yes or no, because you can imagine in my position it's probably not right to do so. However, my view is that actually fuel tax is a very blunt instrument and is perhaps less useful now than it was previously. So just to add my opinion to the mix. Sorry, no, let's go on.
No, that's fine. Fintan, over to you for your pick from the questions.
Yes, kind of thank you, Glenn. I think that actually sort of going through sort of all the questions, they were all sort of very, very good. And I think that one sort of theme I actually sort of picked up was actually very much to actually comment on the future of the transport planning, sort of the actual sort of industry. I think that again, I'm a glass kind of half full sort of person. I think there's going to be a tremendous scope for the skills of the actual transport planning kind of sector after this. I think that we've actually got some sort of very, very sort of powerful tools that have actually been proved kind of over sort of time. We've actually added extra sort of elements over the last 5 to sort of 10 years. So say kind of trying to look to actually try and cover sort of active mode sort of benefits. So that's more sort of cycling, more sort of walking. So we've got a very, very powerful set of sort of tools that sort of we're able to actually use in the post sort of lockdown sort of phase. And I think again, just to actually sort of pick up an actual earlier theme, I think that we've been adding various sort of impact types to sort of guidance sort of over the actual past sort of few years. So I think when sort of things actually get sort of going again, we've got a very, very sort of powerful set of sort of tools to actually use. We've got an extra sort of an actual extra sort of element now in terms of these much sort of larger and sort of wider sort of actual sort of impact types. And I think again we're trying to actually kind of capture more of the social sort of benefits of say sort of transport schemes. So I think in sort of very, very kind of general terms, I think we've got a tremendous we've got a sort of awful lot to actually look sort of forward to, and I guess as well the actual transport planning sort of sector has got a very good sort of data set to actually sort of use. So again, as we actually get back from the current sort of crisis, I think there's a very, very sort of powerful range of tools and sort of data there for us to actually use.
So, I mean, it's interesting as you're referring to tools there, Fintan. I kind of see it in two ways. I see the decision-making tools or the decision support tools, as opposed to the technical knowledge about things we know we can do to make a better transport system that better supports the type of society we think is good socially, economically, and environmentally. And I suppose those are they're related, of course, but two quite different sets. And my feeling from what people have been saying earlier is that we didn't need COVID to show us that we need to have the modal hierarchy that the transport strategy in Scotland has championed and will champion in future. But surely to goodness, COVID-19 has really highlighted that that's necessary. We didn't need COVID-19 to show us that some reallocation of road space could well make sense, and that we need to get this rebalancing within this triple access system. So I suppose the question back to you is whether, when we're coming to tools in terms of the decision support tools to enable some of those mechanisms, do you feel that the tools themselves still remain robust and serviceable?
Yes, I do. I think that the actual kind of transport planning sort of sector has built up these sort of skills over sort of many years, that they actually have been sort of proved. I think we've actually added sort of to those sort of over the actual sort of years. So they still provide a very strong sort of evidence base. I mean, even if a demand sort of patterns change, if there's an actual sort of massive shift, say from sort of road to rail, or sort of road to more sort of active mode use, I think even those that even though those demand patterns have actually changed, we've still got some very powerful tools and sort of models that are still very sort of valid. And I kind of still think as part of our sort of evidence base to sort of government and different sort of agencies, those are actually still the actual best kind of starting point. So I think we don't need to actually go back and actually start from sort of scratch again. I think that, yes, kind of patterns and demand may be very sort of different, but I still think we've got the same base tools that are actually very sort of powerful.
Okay, thank you.
Come in on
Karen,
that?
yes, just briefly, yeah.
Brief comment on there. I think we need to be mindful of the economic impact of basically handing over the car space over to pedestrians and cyclists, and in terms of active modes. And we've got to be mindful that a lot of local authorities, in relation to parking revenue and the actual revenue that local authorities get from parking, the way that we can actually transfer some of the road space over to some of those active modes for cyclists and pedestrians will have an impact on local authorities' revenue. So it kind of we'll be looking to like the central government to kind of assist with the implications of the economic implications, because we really do want to shift some of the road space over to those other modes of transport. But sometimes our decision makers don't allow us to, from the economic point of view. So I think we need to sort of have some assistance from central government to help us.
Although I think the irony there, I appreciate the hard realities, Karen, but the irony is that where you prioritise placemaking and you make it more attractive for people to dwell, you actually encourage more investment in the local economy. And so there's a danger of seeing a very sort of tangible income stream from parking charges, as opposed to all those pedestrians and cyclists putting their hands in their pockets to spend more time in terms of entertainment and retail. Brian, you want to come in on this? And then Sunita will come to you. Brian.
Just on the economic case, just sure people are aware, but I'm going to mention it, that the EU did a report of the external costs of private car use. There's close to €1 trillion per year annual cost that we're paying to subsidise. In the UK, we're only really recouping through taxation, through direct taxation, like a third of the cost of the damage that cars do in terms of collision, in terms of the air quality and the environment, and so on and so forth. And to the tune where every single man, woman and child in the UK is subsidising car use by £900 a year. They're just like, I think that local fee that you can generate can't be like set against the overall cost to society that everybody's paying in there. And we do need a thorough economic assessment, and that's why we're looking to models to just accurately reflect what the costs are. So if someone's paying through their general taxation £100, but you're recovering as a local authority 50p, that's not particularly fair as I see it. And I know it's difficult in terms of revenue, but we do need, and I think the time's right now to do a full economic appraisal of what we're actually doing here. How are we feeding a system that everybody's having to pay for, that is damaging and is not the economically right thing to do? Just wanted to say
and of course, yeah, thank you, Brian. And of course, it highlights that there are so many things that are going to need to change simultaneously, which again kind of rubs against the capacity challenge. Sunita, of course I have a sneaky sense you might be bringing us to public transport. So before you make your entree, just to feed in, if I may, a couple of other questions that have come from today's audience. One is a very logical point being highlighted, which is, if we're all working from home more, what on earth's going to happen to season tickets as the kind of basic bedrock of public transport? And secondly, is there a way, a means to make public transport cheaper without pushing it out of business? But I know that wasn't, I'm being unfair to you, but you've got a clutch of questions to choose from now. Over to you.
Thank you. Yeah, so there was a general theme with the questions that came through from the pre-event questionnaire around public transport confidence that I wanted to pick up on. And so to name check a few of the people that raised those questions, Tom Flanagan, Mark Nightingale, Sylvia Barrett, Nick Bowyer, Andy Flood, Pete Dyson, Stephen Evans, amongst a number of others. You all raised the question around what happens to public transport going forwards from here onwards, and the simple answer is I don't have an answer, because I don't think anybody does. But I think there are two aspects really that you're going to need to consider going forward. One is around how we deal with social distancing, because I don't think we're going to go straight back to where we were before. I think there's going to be an interim position, and I don't know how long that interim position is going to be in play. But there's also a thing around around service provision as well. And I think the range of scenarios that could play out right now are really, really difficult to understand. But I think that it's likely to be that the number of passengers per vehicle is going to remain quite low for a prolonged period. And at some point, in order to ensure that the number of passengers can be carried at a reasonable social distancing place, you might need to increase the number of vehicles in the system. Both of those things are costly. They'll mean increased cost for operating companies, and they'll mean increased cost to the public purse, because the operating companies right now are not going to be able to afford to include those, particularly in the more rural areas. And our experience in Somerset has been that we're struggling to provide a range of services before the outbreak, let alone have a range of services available now with a very, very limited population base and going forward. So I think the situation has really brought into sharp focus that we need to think a little bit differently about how we provide some of this transport in a range of different situations. So for our vulnerable people, we've more recently moved into provision that's been reliant on volunteers, particularly for patient transport and community transport. And during this crisis, those volunteers have drifted away, just because we've been in a situation where volunteers tend to be part of the population that are more vulnerable themselves to this virus. So actually moving back to a normal place, we don't know when those volunteers will likely to come back on stream. And we need to think what the interim scenario is for moving vulnerable people around. Those vulnerable people that I'm talking about are people that are still going to appointments for oncology and renal visits, and they're a very small segment of our society, but they're the ones that we don't count very often. And I think we're very good at looking at the big picture and understanding the bulk of movements, but we're not very good at looking at the very minutiae. And I think particularly in a rural to urban setting, we need to start understanding how those play into a whole system approach. But there are some benefits that we can capitalize on right here and right now. The opportunities to do something different as we move into a new norm is kind of available, and that's a conversation that we need to be having with our teams internally, with our partners, with the operating companies as we're moving forward. It's different in different parts of the country, but here we've had technology for fare payment for a little while, but actually there's still quite a big proportion of people that like to pay for their fare by cash. So there's an opportunity here to push more people onto using that technology. We can start looking at what wasn't working so well and what really was working well. We can start to build some scenarios around what future patronage might look like and what future networks might look like with reduced patronage. And then start to understand where we can go forwards in the future. What are the new ideas? And
okay, I'm sorry, Salita, I'm going to cut in there because you've mentioned scenarios a number of times.
Yeah.
I'm hoping Alison is going to detect this is segueing in her direction. But one can well imagine that our political masters, especially, will be saying, "Well, what's it going to look like afterwards? Tell me." And of course, scenarios are about highlighting the uncertainty as much as there's a question then of what should it look like. But Alison, I know you wanted to pick up on there was a theme within the questions we had beforehand on this. Sorry, Sunita, just moving on.
Okay, thanks, Glenn. Can I just say that I absolutely 100% agree with everything that Sunita's just said, particularly around the challenges associated with serving remote and rural areas. Just to give you a kind of an indication of the scale of the challenge that we're facing in Scotland at this point in time, we've been monitoring trends in terms of travel demand over the last few weeks. So the latest figures we have show that we've got a 90% reduction in bus passengers, a 95% reduction in rail passengers, a 95% reduction in our ferry passengers, which for Scotland is a big issue. A 75% reduction in car use, and yay, a 35% increase in cycling. So in terms of the scale of the challenge and where we're going to go to next in terms of what the new normal might look like and how those scenarios play out, the level of uncertainty is massive. Over the last 6 weeks, I think I alluded to this earlier, within Scotland, we've had to expend a significant amount of resource to bring stability to our public transport sector, in an arena where we can see that continued levels of patronage are going to be low. That's going to be a continuing challenge for us. Just so, for example, bus services are currently running at 40 to 60% in terms of service provision, but they're carrying a lot lower passenger numbers. And the confidence in public transport is something that's a real concern. But going back to the question around scenarios, so there were at least 3 people that raised the question of scenarios in the advanced questions that you sent out. So Tiffany Lynch from London, Stephanie Simard from Toronto, and Stephen Edwards from Walsall. So I probably won't be able to do the questions justice, but just to give you an idea of where we're thinking some of the key sort of factors that are going to influence those scenarios are likely to come from. We've touched on one already around the generalised cost effects and whether there'll be a traditional response to the price of fuel in terms of driving car demand. The other thing that we need to think about here in the lives that we're leading is that kind of freedom or boom effect. As lockdown measures are released, do people like all of a sudden restart those increased levels of activity to make up from the fact that they've had at least 6 weeks of that activity being tempered? How will people travel? Will they have to travel further to get to the leisure activities that they want to access, because the ones that are closer to home have been are out of business, and just generally that kind of reduced choice. So lots of things to think about there. The anxiety effects. will their shopping and discretionary travel trips, given that shopping is seen as one of the areas where you can catch the virus, are people going to want to continue to do that, or will they remain using the safety, the relative safety of the digital age? And then finally, into that digital effect, as people have become more confident with their digital skills, are they less likely to go back to our high streets or our core retail areas to do business? What does that mean for our high streets? And from a working from home perspective, we're seeing dramatic changes in Scotland. Pre-COVID levels of working from home were less than 5%. We're now seeing figures over 40%. So that again, the paradigm shift associated with that is dramatic. From a scenario perspective, just to wind up, because I know that you'll probably be getting anxious that I'm talking too long, a lot of this, I think, for the transport sector relies on what happens with the economy. And we're looking at 4 sort of basic economic models on which we can then overlay the various factors that I've just referred to there to give us an indication of what kind of range we might be looking at in terms of forecast demand, next week, next month, next year, never mind 20 years, which we try and think that our transport models can forecast to. So hopefully that's given some people a bit of an insight into the thinking that we're doing in Scotland, and maybe giving people some ideas that they might want to take forward within their own organisations.
Very useful. Thank you, Alison, and thank you, Sunita. Sorry to kind of cut you off, not quite completing your flight. I'm very conscious that President Roosevelt behind me wouldn't forgive me if we didn't finish on time with our fireside chat, and believe it or not, we've only got a few minutes left. So what I'd like to do is ask each of our panelists, and please be very short and sharp on this. If you had one takeaway from this conversation that you perhaps take back into your teams and continue to ruminate on, what would that takeaway be? So Karen, would you like to start?
Yep, I'm glad you can hear me right at the end.
We can.
Better late than never. Yeah, so thank you for inviting me along today. I've learned a lot, particularly from around the country as well. I'm sure, hopefully we can all keep in contact. So one takeaway that I've taken from here is that, I think we do over consult. In this time of crisis, teams have worked together. We've been able to reduce some silo working that we normally do in local authorities. So I'm going to personally continue, and I'm going to encourage my department to continue to remove those walls, those silos workings, and think out of the box a bit more, and give them the opportunity to just go with it and make decisions and really do make a big change. So that's what I'm going to say.
Okay. Thank you very much, Karen. Sonia.
I think my key takeaway is going to be, I'm going to remain positive and think that, the other side of this crisis, we can come out with a positive outcome from a transport planning perspective, from a societal perspective as a whole, and that we can really come together as a nation.
Okay, thank you. Brian.
Yeah, really, it was like being flexible enough to change some of our systems and approaches. I mean, particularly around the buses, that was a kind of key one, because we're all very much worried about public transport at the moment, and particularly as that's like 50% of the walking trips involved with public transport going forward. So we're really worried about that sector, but I think it's brought us all into focus that we need to think of the system as a whole, and is it as efficient as it could be, and what changes could we make now, and are they for the short term or the long term? And that's really the key to the future for me.
Thank you. Fintan.
Yeah, I think just to actually sort of finish off, I think we're actually clearly in a very sort of difficult time. We don't sort of quite know what the actual kind of timescales are for actually ending this. I mean, I would definitely say that kind of transport planning has an actual sort of a very, very kind of key role to actually play, going sort of forward. So I think the actual kind of takeaway here today is for the sector is actually very sort of positive, actually going sort of forward.
Okay, thank you. And Sunita, and then Alison.
So I think my takeaway is a little bit twofold. One is that we've got lots of skills in our sector that we really can use, but we can use them differently. And so therefore it's about whole systems thinking and not in the old transport planning box, really.
Okay, thank you. Alison.
Okay, so I'm just going to use a phrase that Tim Gent put in his question in the pre-questions, and that was transport planners have superpowers. I don't know why, but it was attractive to me. We are gathering lots of information right now on how travel demand is changing, and we are using that in the most powerful way than we have done in a long time. So the takeaway from me is that actually transport planners should be seen as superheroes, and we should provide the leadership that we know that we can do.
Okay, thank you, Alison. Thank you, everyone. I know some people out there will perhaps be saying we didn't seem to have discussed as much as they'd expected the climate crisis. And I don't think any of us would be kind of implying that this isn't the fundamental challenge ahead of us. Somebody did make early reference to the transport decarbonisation plan that the UK government is putting together over the coming months. And I think for me that is really the impetus that now has to be there in terms of how we're emerging from this. I'm sure everyone joining the call today is part of the transport profession because they want to make a difference, a positive difference to the future. And I know I've used the phrase earlier, but the finishing phrase for me is that we are each of us as professionals facing the fight of our lives, and we really have to stand up and be counted to try and make something positive out of this. Can I conclude before I pass back to Brogan and PTRC just by thanking our panelists hugely for their goodwill and energies in making today, I think, a very vibrant discussion. And thank you to the, I don't know what the scale of audience we've had, Brogan, but certainly the level of interest beforehand was huge. So thank you to all of you for showing interest and sharing your time with us this afternoon. And now back to Brogan.
Awesome, thanks Glenn, and thanks everyone. I thought that was amazing. Round of applause for you. Thank you to our audience. They were amazing. They have so many questions. I think it's led us to believe that maybe we need to have some more specific conversations, like Glenn said, about how we can affect climate change or something like that based on the policies going forward from this. So once again, thank you very much. I'll be sending out some feedback to everyone. If you could please fill it out, it will help us make the next event even better. Awesome, thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank
Bye.
you, and take care.